thanks for being on the program. We're excited to have you here. Dylan and I work together, and we've started this podcast, the Blueprint Podcast. We'd really like to try to get behind the scenes, kind of what is going on in real estate, politics, people who are setting policy, people who are visionaries. And with your experience, your vast experience, 30 years in the commercial banking?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on and just hear some of your insights. I'm sure through all of that experience, you've got some really good insights into business and markets and what's worked for companies and how banks, make decisions on lending large sums of money for these commercial deals. So we're really excited you're here with us.
Well, thank you. It's my honor to be here.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, so for those of you that don't know, I took a couple classes from Gary, and he's just a wealth of information, and we're just going to get right into it. So I heard a story from your class about the most difficult transaction that you've done, or maybe not the most difficult, but there was a complication, and it made me think about what was the hardest transaction that you've financed in your commercial real estate journey?
Probably one that involved the financing of a crude oil production platform. There were way over 100 lenders involved. We had to have tax rulings in the process. Took us approximately 16 months to put the documentation, to go through the negotiation, prepare funding. But we had to have a tax ruling. So at the last minute, literally the last minute, they would not rule. IRS would not rule as we required. So the whole deal fell apart. That was perhaps one of the most difficult, one of the most disappointing transactions that we were right there. But
I think of like people who are maybe starting a business or just going to get a home loan. You just go to the bank and it's like one bank. You just think they just handle everything. So how do you coordinate 100 different lenders? How does that work? How do you bring those people together?
There was a central coordinating broker, it was called, out of Chicago, and they had the real difficult task. I was just one of several lenders involved. My part was challenging at times, simply reading the documents and understanding the documentation, understanding what we were financing and the tax implications of it. But that was unique and different. In most cases, a commercial transaction is sort of by the numbers. You have to go through a certain process that the bank or lender requires, of course, for regulatory purposes as well as safety and soundness. But the two are probably light years apart. The commercial transactions involving construction or a commercial building is relatively simple compared to that particular transaction.
Go ahead.
So what got you interested in commercial real estate financing in the first place?
Well, I started my banking career when I was 18. I just turned 18, needed a job. I was my first year of college and just happened to walk into a bank and they were hiring. And 30, 40 years later, I still haven't changed occupation. The interest at first was just because the time frame fit school and skiing, which were important to me.
Yeah, we can relate to that.
Particularly the latter. But as time went on and I become more vested in the industry, finishing school, it became obvious that this was what I was meant to do. And so over the years, generally in most banks, you move from desk to desk, and you end up doing a lot of different things, everything from collection, consumer lending. You get your toes involved in small commercial loans, and then you just kind of, with time and experience, you move up. And I found that commercial lending, commercial real estate lending, was an area that I had a passion and a real interest in. And so I just tried to navigate and keep my career going in that commercial real estate era.
So you worked in 11 different states?
I have. I've lived in and worked in most of the Western states. Yes.
Wow. I'm curious too, like you say, a lot of it's by the numbers. So numbers are pretty easy to calculate out and see if they work. But I'm sure you get people who come in with a business idea and it's going to be the next latest and greatest thing. But you've seen so many businesses across so many industries over the last 3 decades. How do you balance the number side, which is probably pretty easy to calculate, with the forecast or the unknowns? There's always the entrepreneur that's really excited,
Indeed.
but yet you've got experience from. You're not just looking at one business. You've looked at thousands of businesses over 30 years. What kind of common trends do you see, or what kind of things do you look at as a commercial banker to go, okay, there's the numbers, but then how are we servicing the market? What is the market? How do you kind of analyze that piece?
Sure. Well, in commercial lending in general, and certainly real estate lending, commercial real estate lending, there's what we call MC squared, and that's management, cash flow, and collateral. And those are the 3 elements of success or not. Mm-hmm. Management, obviously, you have to have a good plan. You have to have experience. You have to have the financial wherewithal to support your idea or your dream. The project, either if it's an existing project, has to cash flow. We all want to look at the NOI, the net operating income statement. Yeah. Will it service debt? And of course, if it doesn't, and if it's a new transaction, then you're basing your decision on a pro forma. Well, is there adequate equity? And how do you define adequate? Yeah. Is it 70-30, 80-20, 50-50? There's no magic number. Right. But ideally, an investor has to have a reasonable amount of equity in the transaction. Right. We all deal with risk. The investor deals with risk. The lender deals with risk. Unfortunately, in most cases, the lender has the biggest share of the risk. The lender has 70% or 80% of the risk. So if something goes bad, if the economy turns suddenly, if the building is no longer attractive to the market, then your 20% equity can disappear in the blink of an eye. Right. And then the collateral itself. How old is it? How stable is it? How attractive is it? Does it meet the new expectations of the tenants? Are there environmental issues? There are literally dozens and dozens of different. And would you make? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Would you make that decision as the commercial banker when you're saying there's no magic number, whether it's 70-30 or 80-20? Are you, as the commercial banker, kind of making that determination? Like, you're looking at what their plan is, you're looking at what they have in equity or liquid cash, and you're just going, well, okay, we'll do it. Or sure. Is that how it works? Or well, almost. Yeah. In most cases, when a client comes to us, they have an idea as to what they can invest in it. They know what their equity is going to be. Now, that may or may not be satisfactory to the bank because of the perceived risk associated with the transaction. Right. The lender may say, 20% just isn't enough. We're going to need another 10 or 20% on top of what's your equity. And then that puts the challenge on the investor to either come up with that through their assets or they bring in additional investors. Yeah. So not every deal is different. So every deal is unique.
So how do you weigh those different thresholds based on like the type of asset or the risk and reward? Because new construction and the development side of things would be very different from an existing property that's already cash flowing. Mm-hmm. So what's the difference in how you analyze those two different types of deals?
There's no magic one way, but of course, every transaction has risk. I don't care how successful they've been in the past. Yeah. Every transaction has risk associated with it. And for example, construction lending has greater risk than financing an existing facility. Yeah. Every transaction has to be measured in terms of risk. And by that I mean has to be quantified. And every lender has their own unique risk qualification and quantification process. It may run 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, 1 being the best, maybe 10 being the worst. There is a minimum at which the loan will pass muster, so to speak. And let's just say for our discussion, that's 3. So if the transaction is perceived to be 3 or better, then it meets the management, the cash flow, and collateral standard, then it's more than likely going to be approved or looked at favorably anyway.
So, sorry to cut you off.
No.
So can you walk us through what the transaction looks like from your perspective, from start to finish, and how big is that operation? How many people are involved in analyzing the risk and pulling the pieces together for a large size deal?
Well, the process starts, of course, with a client coming to us and asking if we're interested in a specific transaction. And in a perfect world, which of course we don't operate in, we ask for a business plan. And sometimes a business plan is in writing and is very complimentary of the transaction. In other cases, it's just up here. That's probably the least desirable from our standpoint, because then we have to pull that information out, and that can be a lengthy process. But if we have a business plan with pro formas and NOIs and appropriate financial information, we should be able to make a decision, depending on a lot of variables. But we should be able to make a decision and be ready to fund within at least 30 days. In terms of the number of people involved, it depends on the size of the institution. In some cases, there may be just 1 or 2 individuals. In another case, it may be a loan officer and a loan committee. And so the committee could be 3 to 7 people. So you have to prepare your application and your write-up and present that to the committee. Then they evaluate it and make a decision.
How do you guys evaluate the management component of that MC squared?
Yeah.
How do you guys look at that?
That is and always has been, and probably always will be, the biggest challenge. How do you look at management? And it's not a simple process. But for one thing, for example, we'd like to see a resume. We'd like to see what their background is, their experience, where they go to school. Not that is a big issue, but background and experience and education is important. What kind of on-the-job experience? How many years experience do they have in building or managing or investing?
Right.
We look at FICO scores, and everyone should check their FICO at least quarterly. And then we may look at contacting references. There are a couple of websites, government websites, that we have to check to make sure that they're not the individual is listed on that website.
Right.
Yeah. So it's it is quantitative,
right,
but it's somewhat subjective.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at, let's say someone brings you a deal that's so far out there, such a large size deal, but it's very innovative, but there's no track record. They pull in a cool team and they want to have this idea come to fruition, but it's just an idea. And how do you, from your perspective, take someone in that position and turn just an idea, like a good idea, into a reality? And there's a high risk involved in that, but has there ever been a situation where you've run into something like that and it's actually played out?
There has been. I can think of 2 or 3 cases, but the challenge with that is having the adequate insight and understanding. The individual may be really excited about it, but what they tell us are the features, and what we need to know is what are the benefits. Because in any sales environment, ideally you're selling benefits, not necessarily features. So how is this going to succeed? What can you show us that will help remove the big R, and that's risk. What kind of background do you have in this, if any? And if there's no experience, if members of the management team or investment team have no experience in this endeavor, that's a big hurdle to get over. But it's part science and part art on both of our parts.
Right.
The science, of course, is the math aspect, the quantitative, the balance sheets, the income statement, the cash flow statements, the NOI, the pro formas. That's the science. The art is actually completing the project and then marketing it to a market that may be unknown, particularly if it's really new and creative. It could be wildly successful, or on the other hand, it could be a dud from the moment. And of course, if it's a dud, who stands to lose the most?
Yeah.
The lender.
So in that type of situation, that's, I guess, a missing part for a lot of people's understanding of, well, they got this whole deal financed and they took the risk, they took the chance. Let's say it doesn't work out.
Mm-hmm.
What's next? What happens at that point?
Well, that is the most undesirable part of the business.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things that the borrower should do, the investor should do, is keep an open line of communication with the lender. We don't like surprises.
Right.
And we shouldn't, this is perhaps more theory than practicality, but the lender shouldn't have to call and ask for a payment.
Mm-hmm.
The lender shouldn't have to send a letter and say, hey, your payment's late. It happens all the time, but it shouldn't be.
Right.
The investor, the manager, the owner should take the initiative to come in and see the lender and say, look, we're experiencing some difficult times. Now, here's our latest financial statement. And as you can see, the trends are not good. This is our plan. This is our strategy.
Right.
We may not be able to make payments on time for 3 months or 4 months or 5 months, whatever it is. If we can talk those things through, if we're not surprised, if we don't have to constantly call for a payment, that creates a much better operating environment.
Right.
And the last thing a lender wants to do, absolutely the last thing, is to foreclose. Everybody loses, include the bank or lender, if you foreclose. In my career, I bet I can count on one hand the number of times we've had to foreclose and we've just broke even.
Yeah.
In most cases, the bank is going to lose.
Yeah. I think it's interesting what you said about how people will come in with an idea, maybe they're excited about the features, but you're looking at the benefits. What other kind of subset of insights do you have along those lines? Because I'm sure over the years, there's been a lot of things where like, okay, you're excited about this, but we need to know this, or
Sure.
You're focused on this, but this is the part that really we found from experience is what really makes the difference. Are there any other kind of things that you, from your experience, that you would point to that are like common things that you go, okay, well, that's great, but
Yes.
this is what's really important. Because that's kind of what this podcast is about, is like, what's really important?
Indeed.
Because let's focus on those things, because the other stuff doesn't really matter. It could be exciting, but it's not where the rubber hits the road.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we could summarize that by saying there's one most important aspect of a transaction like that. And it is not only one, it is so far ahead of two, and that's cash flow.
Yeah.
Cash flow pays back a loan, nothing else.
Yeah.
Collateral doesn't, good intentions doesn't.
Yeah.
Cash flow is the only thing that pays back a loan. And it's incumbent upon the borrower to demonstrate the ability of this transaction to generate cash flow,
Right.
and it's incumbent upon the lender to evaluate through the risk analysis process confirmation that the investor's analysis is correct.
So really that borrower, that person, the entrepreneur, really needs to demonstrate their plan for the cash flow above anything
Absolutely.
else.
Absolutely.
It comes right down. And then you said like meeting a need is like the important thing.
Sure. Well, there has to be a market need for any product that we have. Whatever product that a business is going to bring to market, it has to satisfy a need that a customer has, or a client, or a market.
Mm.
Yeah.
And unless they're servicing that need and providing answers and solutions, then it's going to be an uphill battle for the investor.
Well, Gary, we're going to take a quick break right now. And when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about the management piece. And so we'll be back right after this.
Indeed.
Well, Gary, thanks for staying on for another segment.
Indeed.
You said something that got me thinking about that management piece. And I love how you put that MC squared. I think that's going to be a really valuable takeaway. But I'm wondering, when you have someone who starts out a business, maybe starts out a small business, does it ever become a challenge as that business grows for that initial management team to grow with it? Because I can imagine that sometimes things can be really successful and take off and makes it challenging for the management team.
Indeed.
Are there any insights or advice on that you would give to a prospective entrepreneur who's starting off an endeavor?
Well, as we know, every business starts off as a startup at some point. And so you have an investor that may have a couple of dollars and it has a great idea. So they get the organization off the ground, they hire people, they start marketing their products successfully, and they grow and they grow and they grow. It's not uncommon for an organization to reach a certain size where they need to complement their management team. They need to bring in people that have different skills, not better skills, but just different skills. You know, if we're all CPAs, if we're all attorneys, if we're all bankers, then we're only going to think one way.
Right.
So part of the value of a successful company is the diversity of management. We all have our strengths, and then we all have our limitations. Mm-hmm. And I think it's extremely important for management to recognize that we need to augment our management team and bring in someone that can complement us and help us achieve the next level, which we all know we can achieve.
Right.
So if you have this one individual entrepreneur who has this big idea, and then he is really great at building connections, really good at relationship building, and pulls in a team of extremely high level professionals mm-hmm. and advisors, how does the management move from there? Is that enough to qualify the individual with this new team of professionals?
We all tend to surround ourselves with people like us. Yeah. I think that's just a normal trait. Right. But kind of using your example, ideally, this individual that is now going to this management, this investor that's going to bring somebody else in to help run the team. My recommendation is to give serious thought to bringing in a CFO, somebody that understands the numbers.
Yeah.
What's the language of business?
Accounting,
exactly. And so unless the investor is extremely strong in accounting, they probably need someone early on to keep their records clean and keep them up to date, and most importantly, keep them accurate.
Right.
Because the bank will see right through that. If the balance sheet doesn't balance and the income statement has information that's not correct, that's obvious, then that's going to affect credibility and will probably result in a quick no.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the most important financial reports for an entrepreneur to really gauge how their business is doing?
Sure. Depend on the business.
Yeah.
But let's say it's commercial real estate.
Yeah.
Balance sheet, NOI are two of the most important. The NOI statement, as we know, tells us how this piece of real estate is performing.
Right.
It tells us whether this particular project will support the debt service. And if it does, at what level? Now, this isn't a magic ratio, but a lot of lenders look at a 1.25 debt service coverage ratio. And that simply means that they have $1.25 for every dollar they owe in monthly debt. And so you want to be able to manage that on a monthly basis, not just once a year. And the worst thing we can do is hire a CPA, and then when they give us the material, it looks pretty good, throw it in the desk drawer and never. Yeah. That should be part of our management analysis every month.
Yeah.
So the DSCR ratio, does that change with the risk of the project? Do you use 1.25 on this scenario and then 2 on this scenario because it's a higher risk property?
Yes, because for whatever reason, it may be a higher risk. Mm-hmm. There may be a concern about the property location, just a myriad of possibilities that can, risk is a perception.
Right.
And your perception of a risk would be different than mine, and mine would be different than yours. Mm-hmm. And so it is not necessarily a highly quantifiable only analysis. It's One reference that I like to look at is if you look at an iceberg that's floating in the ocean, you can see the risk that's above the surface level.
Right.
But that's a small part of it, because most icebergs, the biggest part of the iceberg's below the surface. Well,
Right.
in many cases, the biggest part of the risk is below the surface that we can't see, that we can only identify by analysis, by reviewing multiple years financial information, and truly completing a very in-depth due diligence process.
In part of that evaluation, do you guys, as the bank, will you also adjust the interest rate based on the risk? Maybe there's how much collateral, but
Absolutely.
it's okay, we're interested, but only because we feel it's risky, only at this interest rate.
Yes, absolutely. Now,
So there's a lot of flexibility in moving parts and what can be
There is.
negotiated.
sure.
Yeah.
But something we need to keep in mind, that a borrower needs to keep in mind, is interest rate is just one of the points that should be negotiated. But risk will not eliminate or compensate, cannot be compensated by a higher interest rate. In other words, if you go from 7 to 8, that's going to compensate for the risk. That's not going to mitigate the risk. The
Right.
risk is still there.
That's a good point too.
So one analysis is that, look, if they can't make a payment at 7%, what makes us think they can make a payment at 8%?
Right.
Well, so
Right.
then let's say you do try to offset the risk with a higher interest rate. Wouldn't that almost make it more risky, because it would make the payments more difficult
That's a
to come
valid
up with?
observation, absolutely. And that's something that I think that both the lender and the investor needs to keep in mind, is if it's going to be tight at 7%, it's going to be tighter at 8%.
Mhm. Almost making it less feasible.
Less desirable.
Less
Yes,
desirable. Mhm.
sure.
Well, kind of shifting gears a little bit too, I'm kind of curious. You talked about getting out of college and realizing that commercial banking is what you want to do. What aspects of the commercial banking did you just go, man, I love this?
Oh, I
wanna
think
do
that, yeah, without a question, the diversity of transactions.
Yeah.
At least in my view, when I show up every day, I don't know what's ahead.
Yeah.
I don't know what opportunities are going to present it, what risk I'm going to see, what kind of new exciting project am I going to be invited to be part of.
Yeah.
And I get bored pretty easily.
Yeah.
And so I love the diversity of looking at different transactions,
Yeah.
different people, different expectations, different markets.
Could you talk a little bit too about when you first got started, you were maybe kind of one of the technicians in the bank,
Yes.
doing a certain role.
Indeed.
And then when you were running these banks, how did the skill set have to shift, and how did what kind of skills does it take to do the job as the person who runs the bank versus someone who's more of the technicians doing
Sure.
some of the stuff inside?
There is a big difference.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the example I gave. You might be a good pilot, but you may not be good at managing the airlines.
Right.
And the same thing is true in banking. We all have to go through the process. So you may spend a few years as a technician honing your skills, developing your understanding of balance sheets, income statements, NOIs, et cetera. But if you at some point take on a level of management or senior management, then your technical skills are important, but your people skills are a lot more important.
Yeah.
I know it's almost a worn out cliche, but the biggest asset that any of us have and the biggest cost is staff.
Hmm.
And most of us don't leave a job. We don't quit a job because we don't like the job. We quit or leave the job because we don't like our boss.
Right.
And that is, some people just have the innate ability to be a good people person,
Mhm.
and others are much better at being a technician.
Yeah.
And kind of realizing that or accepting that within ourselves is sometimes difficult. Ideally, we kind of grow up in an environment where we want to grow, we want to progress, we want a greater supervision.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's not always the best direction for us.
Right.
So I guess like everyone has this, or maybe not everyone, but people have this desire to be the CEO and
Yes.
and the manager and the top dog. But that's it's almost ego, because it's not playing into their specific skill set. And they would be sometimes more successful if they just really understood, like, this is what I'm really good at.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of value in that.
Absolutely. There is nothing at all wrong with being the best credit analyst in the bank. That is and from a compensation standpoint, it may not pay as much as the president, but you also don't have the responsibility. You don't have the stress. And there's always a need. There's more need and demand for good credit analysts than there are president and CEOs.
Yeah. Well, I think regardless of whether you're starting a business or moving up in the bank, it's like, I think just the awareness that there are different skill sets than just the one job you do right now.
Indeed.
And as you move up, and as your organization grows, or as you move up into different positions, your skill sets may be required to be slightly different. And
Absolutely.
if you're willing to work on those and just be aware of it,
Sure.
then
Well, the worst thing we can do is hire people like ourselves.
yeah,
We should try to hire somebody that's better than us,
right.
that has more skills, that has more understanding of a product or a project or a market.
Yeah.
Then we all grow, we all benefit.
Yeah.
But that's kind of sometimes emotionally difficult for
Yeah, I was going to say
managers to do.
that's a really powerful point, but I think sometimes people don't like to have. They're worried about being outshined.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
yeah, they're perceived to be a threat.
Or
instead
they're
of
a
an
threat.
asset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said something else interesting too about seeing your staff as the greatest asset or the greatest cost. I think that's kind of important too, because some people might just see it as a cost, or these employees are just, the world would be perfect if there just weren't people in it,
Well put. Well, it is not only the most important asset, but it's also the most expensive.
Yeah.
The biggest expense that any company has. And we should look to the idea of having the greatest input from that employee, the greatest value, the best employee we can support.
Yeah.
And they in turn will help the company grow and become stronger and generate more profit.
Yeah.
You always want good, strong employees, which means we have to train them. We have to understand their needs and their expectations.
Yeah.
And help give them that, what would you call it, work-life balance. That work doesn't necessarily mean that we should be there 12 hours a day.
Right.
Sometimes there are 12-hour days, but let's hope that's not a standard. That's not. Nobody benefits from that.
Yeah, it speaks to some. It may not be for some people that so much how much money they're making, but it could be other factors in the job,
Absolutely.
like you said.
Sure, that balance. Indeed.
Well, let me ask you this from your experience. I'm just curious to your maybe kind of some of your guiding principles on this. I think, and maybe this is not the greatest way to look at it, but I think like every employee wants the most money for the least amount of work, right? And every employer wants the most amount of work for the least amount of money, right? And somewhere in the middle, there's a balance where we agree to bring you on at this rate because that's an equitable, or that's perceived as, agreeable. But what are things that you found in your leadership with leading teams you found to be effective or important, aside from just the money component, to really help employees feel like, hey, this is where I want to be. Like, I'm getting a benefit out of this, and this is important to me.
Well, to begin with, it has to be built on a solid foundation. The foundation of a building is most important to that structure. Well, the same thing is true when we're developing employee-employer relationships. Not only do we want an employee that meets our standards, that we've written down in the personnel manual. Right. They meet that, and that's an assumption that is reasonable. But then, more important than that is, what is unique about this employee? What have they done perhaps outside of their particular career? What have they done in school, or what are some of their extracurricular activities? What are their interests? What are their hobbies? And how can that skill set, how can that analytical thinking process be brought into the company? How can we grow? How receptive are employees to new projects? When you go to an individual and say, look, we're thinking about doing X. We've never done X before. We don't know how to do X. Is that something that you're willing to take on? Are you willing to become our X expert?
Yeah.
And if they jump on it with both feet, they can become a star.
And then I guess there's another part of it where this manager or some managers become micromanagers.
Yes.
And playing into that person's abilities and just trusting them and their strengths, because a lot of employees get, like you said, turned off by their managers, and that's what causes them to quit. But by having trust in your abilities and the abilities of your employees, that plays a huge part as well.
Absolutely. This is just a personal opinion, but micromanagers have a feeling within themselves that there's a degree of inadequacy. There's a conception that if this person doesn't do their job to the highest level, it's going to make me look bad. They're over concerned about themselves, and they have a degree of maybe failing because this employee. They have doubt in themselves, and that is manifest by being a micromanager. I'm sure we've all worked for micromanagers in our time, and in many cases they're great people outside the office, but they're so fearful of what's inside. And the question is, why? Why do they feel that way? Is that just their personality, or is their boss creating that challenge for them?
So for the
can we just adjust his mic? Let's see how it's kind of. You might have to just twist that little knob right there on the side. Yeah, just loosen it and then raise it up and then tighten it. Raise it just not too much.
That better?
And then just tighten it good and tight. I think it started out there and it's just been slowly going down.
So for the managers that would listen to this, what's some advice that you would give them if they're hiring on employees or they have this staff that they have this inherent need to micromanage, but to be an effective leader, you need to trust the people that you work with. What would be some advice that you could give the manager for how to effectively operate a team?
It is grossly easy to say this or to give the advice. It is extremely difficult to execute it for that individual that has the need to micromanage. But in my experience, the best one of the maybe better processes is if you're going to assign an individual a project, assign it to them, make vividly sure that they understand it. And in the best way, in my view, is give it to them in writing, and make sure that every aspect of this process is identified to the extent you can. Then give them a timetable, make it quantifiable and measurable. Give them a timetable and say, let's meet on this every Tuesday at 10 o'clock, and we'll talk about the progress. If you have issues or concerns, I'm here as a resource for you. I will try to eliminate all the obstacles in your way, but it's your project, and I know you're going to do a great job on it. And let's just meet once a week on Tuesday at 10, and you can tell me how it's going, and then leave them alone.
Yeah,
let them do their job. And if they're gonna fail, they're gonna fail whether you're micro or whether you're letting them do their job. On the other hand, if they really move on this opportunity, they could far exceed your expectations and be wildly successful.
I think there's something to be said about expressing that confidence, giving them the clear direction and letting them go. Had a basketball coach when I was in high school that once told him to get the ball to Fielding and everybody get out of the way. And I remember thinking, there's no way I'm missing this shot. Because they had that much confidence. You don't want to let them down.
Absolutely not.
But you said something I thought was really interesting, because I think it's common managerial practice maybe to look at people's strengths within their job, and try to assign people to different tasks. But you said something about looking at what makes this individual unique, even outside of work. Like what's unique about this person as an individual. That takes a lot more effort for a manager to get to that level.
It does indeed.
But I can see how that would mean so much to the employee to know that they care that much, but then to translate that back as a manager to then how do those unique qualities, aside from how well they can produce a spreadsheet, factor into their job or what positions they would be unique for. And I can see how that would be really meaningful. I'm curious if, in your experience, you have any managers that you've had that stick out to you that were really good at leading people, maybe what some of those qualities were.
Yeah, without a doubt. There are two or three that I've worked for over the years that they were mentors. They probably didn't know it, but I always perceived them to be a mentor. I tried to emulate them. I tried to adapt their habits. And in many cases, they were very experienced at what they were doing. And so I felt they had achieved that level simply because of the years that they have kind of paid their dues. They've learned the process. And so if I try to emulate them, that would be to my best interest. But a couple of them that come to mind were very disciplined, not only self-disciplined, but their expectation was pretty high for me and for the other employees.
Yeah.
And if we failed, it wasn't the end of the world. It was not what they wanted, the outcome, but it was a learning experience. And so it's not that we failed. We just learned one way not to do it.
Yeah.
And particularly in banking or finance, where a lot of what we do is financial oriented, anybody can calculate a current ratio. Anybody can calculate a cap rate. That's not the secret. The secret is interpreting that. What does that mean? And if a company has $500,000 in working capital, does that mean they're golden, that they're just in great shape? Absolutely, it doesn't. Mm-hmm. If we only know they have $500,000 working capital, we don't know what that means, right, unless we have looked at 3 or 4 years financial statements. What if the industry has $800,000 in working capital, and what if last month or last quarter or last year they had $300,000 in working capital? Then that shows progress. If they had $800,000, which is consistent with the industry, then they're losing ground. So now that we know that, why? Yeah. What's causing that?
So I guess understanding the individual also plays a huge role in the negotiation process of the relationship between the bank and the borrower.
Indeed.
How does that process typically unfold?
It's kind of like, how do you evaluate the management? That's the biggest challenge, because, in some cases in today's environment, we may never meet until we sign the documents, which in my view is not to either party's best interest. I think there's great value in us sitting down with a potential borrower, an investor, or group of investors, and getting to know them, maybe having lunch, having coffee, going to their office. We can learn a lot about an individual by how they decorate or how they keep their office. Mm-hmm. The more we know about that individual, the better decisions we can make for our institution as well as for their company.
Yeah.
And we only do that by getting to know someone better. Resume will give us a little insight, but if we talk to a couple of references, that'll give us a little more insight. If we look at the FICO scores, that gives us a little more insight. And then you consolidate all that information, and then you're guessing.
Yeah.
So then what advice could you give to a borrower to get more favorable terms from the lender?
That is a great question, and it's one that if the borrower would follow this recommendation, their lending relationship would be better, and it would probably be financially stronger. Put it in writing, and ask for what you want. Don't just go to the bank and say, "Hey, I've got this project. It's going to cost $10 million. How much can I borrow?"
Yeah.
That is the worst thing you can do. Take the time to put it in writing and identify, if anything, overdo it. Now, I'm not talking about a book, but it's not unreasonable to have an 8 to 10 to 12 page narrative. That's just the narrative. And then you support that with your financials. That helps mitigate risk. It tells the borrower that the borrower truly understands this project. And what's the biggest mitigant to risk is if you had to to just identify one mitigant, information.
Yeah.
And that's true whether you're the investor or whether you're the lender.
So that person's not just taking a piece of paper and walking into the bank down the street. They're not going to talk to those people. Who's the person that they want to go to? It's also not just a standard home mortgage lender.
Yeah, no,
for these
not at all.
commercial transactions, who do they go to, and who are those key people that they need to present this idea to?
And that is extremely important to know that. How you get to know that is not an easy process from the lender or from the investor standpoint. Get a referral. Who completed a project like that? Who's in your industry that you've developed relationships with? And in my view, if you're in the real estate commercial building industry, you should get to know as many investor owners, property managers in that business as possible. And what do they recommend? Who are they recommending? Are they recommending Bank A, Credit Union Y, Mortgage Broker X? Who are they recommending?
And that just comes back to the relationships.
It does.
Just being connected
Absolutely.
to these individuals and building your network of people.
Yes. Brokers, as a lender, I kind of favor brokers because they have incredible contacts. They have not only me to look to finance a project, but they probably have another 10 or 20 or 30 guys like me that will do that project. So if they bring a deal to me, I'm going to do my best to make that happen in a timely manner so this broker will bring the next deal to me. I have high regards for commercial loan brokers.
I have a question too. You talked about the importance of communication, how the bank shouldn't have to send you a letter for a payment. Like you should, I don't like surprise. You should go in and take the initiative.
Absolutely.
And it reminded me of a story. My grandfather was a cattle rancher, and my father told me that he remembers his dad, my grandfather, taking him with him to the bank to meet the banker, because he stressed to my father how important it is to have a good relationship with your banker. And that's back when the days when people met face to face. There was no DocuSign or anything like that. And I'm curious, in your time in the industry, what kind of shift you've seen from that, because that really made an impression on me. And my dad always said, you need to have a relationship with your banker, and you need to establish that credit before you need it.
Yes, absolutely.
And he really stressed the importance of the relationship. So anytime I've opened up an account, we've moved and we're getting a new bank, I've kind of shopped and decided, are these people that I'm going to be able to come in and talk to, or am I just a number coming through the door? But I'm curious to see how relationships continue to play out, and the importance of that, and how maybe that's changed over the last 30 years.
Oh, I think it's changed dramatically, and it will continue to change. In past years, a lot was done on a handshake. But you knew your borrower more intimately than you do today. You knew their business. You knew somewhat about their personal life as well. And you just developed that level of confidence in them that you could do a deal on a handshake. Obviously, it has to be in writing, has to meet all the legal requirement. But in today's environment, there are big loans made that the loan officer will never meet this individual other than maybe at closing. Everything is done online, over the phone. It's becoming more that way.
Right.
There's a couple of really important things to a borrower. And one is, of course, getting to yes. And the other is getting to yes in the least amount of time.
Right.
And I think the best thing that we can do for a client is to give them an answer. Even if that answer is no, give it to them as soon as we possibly can. If we string them out, and I think a lot of us bankers have been guilty of this. We'll put this on the credenza, and I just need to think about it. Well, if you have to think that hard about it, that means you have doubts. So I think you need to respond as fast as you can to your client. But we're moving to that point of artificial intelligence that's gonna put guys like me out of business.
Yeah. Do you still see a place though for the relationship in that transaction, or is it now just going to be strictly electronic?
I think out of necessity, it's going to become more distant. Have you tried contacting a person at a lot of different institutions. You talk to an automated system that wants to send you an address so you can go on computer and talk to them.
Right.
That seems to be the direction we're going. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I don't think there's anything better than an eyeball-to-eyeball relationship.
Right.
So that's going to become a scarce resource, like human-to-human connection. Because we were just talking about this morning, where with the progression of artificial intelligence, you can already see these chat bots talking directly to customers, but at some point it's going to be chat bots talking to chat bots. And then when you're in the industry and you're creating this business or trying to get this loan or funding for something, having those higher up connections is going to be so scarce in the industry. Right. And it's going to be a competitive advantage for the people who do make those connections. And if they still prioritize communicating with the individuals who are in charge of those chatbots and in charge of their employees, that's going to be definitely differentiating as far as that individual's success.
Without a doubt. I think some financial institutions are moving more rapidly to that automated process because they can do it faster. But you certainly lose a strong personal element when you do that. In the old days, you used to have, my people will contact your people.
Yeah.
Well, now it's my computer will contact your computer.
Right.
And I'm not sure that's to the market's best interest.
Yeah.
That's just a personal
I'm sure there's
opinion.
some efficiencies gained, but I wonder what valuable aspects are lost in the margins.
Indeed.
From that.
In my view, there are some major losses in the process.
Because at the end of the day, if I have this great product and I know that I can make it happen and I present it to my computer to send to your computer, it's just going to get lost in a file system.
Yes, that's right.
But if I make an effort or I have this close connection to the CEO of this company and I'm like, well, like this is my idea and here's the data also, here's the information also, I'm going to stand out. And that's going to be, I'm at the top of the pile now.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people with this new technology that makes everything so much more accessible and easy, I don't know if people are going to continue to put in that personal effort. And I think the people who do will benefit.
Well, I think you're right. Part of the challenge, going back several years, there was a pretty big survey completed, and I forget which financial organization did it, but it was estimated that approximately half of all business loans were turned down the first time. And that the first time was most important part of that statement, because the second time, for whatever reason, they were approved. And the reason it was approved was because the first time the lender didn't understand the project. And to a great extent, that's because the borrower didn't take the time or effort, or the banker didn't take the time and effort to understand the project. And the less you know about something, the greater the perceived risk associated with it.
Yeah. I thought that was interesting what you said about the thing that mitigates risk is information. Whether you're making a decision in your personal life or investment. My dad used to always say, well, you're stressed out about it right now because you just need more information.
Yeah,
absolutely. And that stress comes from that risk level. So I thought that was really interesting.
Does indeed.
Gary, I wanted to ask you a little bit. So currently you're the executive director of PW Partners Consulting.
Correct.
So what kind of consulting do you serve? Do you get into these kinds of things when you're consulting with your clients?
Yeah. Initially, PW Partners was a bank consulting company only. A partner and I started. We complemented one another, and that was during a time when banks were really struggling. There was a lot of bank failures, a lot of bank problems as a result of the great crisis of 2008.
Yeah, and
so at that time, we worked exclusively with banks, but over time we've changed. My partner, I bought out, and now we work with banks, credit unions. We've worked with universities, attorneys, a fair amount of aviation work. We work with a lot of real estate projects, just primarily on the financing feasibility side.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about construction.
Yeah.
But on the financial side.
So, and you don't have to call out any specific ones, but like say you're going into a university, are they calling you and going, hey, we're struggling, our financials aren't doing good, or what kind of consulting, what are the problems like say a university has that are calling you to say, hey, we need you to come in and look at this and give us some advice?
Yeah. Well, these were all financial related projects, primarily dealing with training. I've worked with 2 universities, and both were somewhat on the training side. I wrote a couple of, call them books, but they were kind of like booklets for them. And it's because of services they were providing to the market.
That were financial in nature?
That were financial in nature, real estate in nature, banking in nature. We don't do any consulting on how to run a university or financing, but it's all pretty narrow within our historical scope of work.
Well, that's really interesting. Well, Gary, it's been awesome to have you on here. We're going to need to have you back.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
We can go into so many more topics.
Indeed. I'm honored to be here.
I don't know if you had any other questions you wanted to.
I have a million, which is why I think we got to do another one of these.
Yeah, we want to be respectful of your time. But man, this has been great. You've said a lot of great things.
Thank you so much.
I'm excited to listen to this back, so it's going to be good.
It's been my honor.
Awesome. Thanks, Gary.
Gary.